Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining us this evening. I'm Matthew Silverman, Director of the Haberman Institute for Jewish Studies, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to our lecture with Dr. Edna Friedberg, who will be exploring Censoring the Holocaust, How Books Shape Our View of a Painful Past. A special thank you to the generosity of the Wagner Braunsberg Family Foundation for sponsoring this lecture as part of our ongoing series on German Jewish heritage. We also extend our gratitude to Andrew R. Ammerman for sponsoring our Winter 2026 lecture series. Andrew dedicates this semester's learning in loving memory of Josephine and H. Max Ammerman and Stephen C. Ammerman. Sponsoring lectures is a meaningful way to honor or remember a loved one or to mark a significant occasion, such as a yard site, a personal or professional achievement, or a milestone celebration. Your sponsorship donations, as well as contributions at all levels, allow us to continue offering these lectures free of charge for all participants. Our next program is on a very different subject. Next Tuesday, February 10th at 7:30 Eastern Time, we will journey through the Jewish history of chocolate with Rabbi Deborah Prince. I hope you will join us online again next week and maybe enjoy some chocolate during the talk. For more information on this program and how to get involved, please visit our website. As always, feel free to submit your questions via the Q&A button on your Zoom screen. Kindly keep them as concise as possible and incomplete sentences. We'll address them at the end of the lecture, though you can submit them at any point during the presentation. This lecture is being recorded and will be available on our website. And now it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Edna Friedberg was a historian and senior curator at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum and the host of the museum's award-winning Stay Connected programs on YouTube and Facebook. She has testified before the U.S. Congress about anti-Semitism, was the founding historian of the museum's multilingual online Holocaust Encyclopedia, and curated a special exhibit on the Nuremberg trials and international justice. Her essays have appeared in publications including The Atlantic, The Washington Post, The Chicago Tribune, and The Forward. And with that, I now welcome Dr. Friedberg to join us. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Matt, and thank you also to your colleagues, to Becky, and to all of your donors for supporting this lecture. It's really a pleasure to be here with all of you and to be part of the Haberman Institute family today. Tonight, I will be talking to you about censoring the Holocaust, about books and also about movies related to this topic and how they have been banned, redacted, changed, distorted, protested over time. But I want to begin with some really old history. And if we could put up the first slide, it's probably not what you're expecting. When I say old history, I mean actually ancient, thing actually from the 3rd century BCE, an illustration from China. In this illustration, which is from the period of Emperor Qin Shi Huang, he burned books of philosophy and history as a way of consolidating power. This emperor sought to elevate his status as the supreme ruler in his new empire, and he did not want to be compared to more virtuous or successful rulers before him. By destroying the writings of the past, Emperor Qin thought that history could begin anew with him. And I am beginning this talk by giving you a little bit of the backdrop of the context with which book censorship and book bans has evolved over time, because the idea that a person can control information, can control what a wider public or what even their own children read and know is very, very old. This is also an increasingly popular and therefore increasingly dangerous trend that we see here in the United States. Since 2021, so in the last 5 years, the free speech advocacy group PEN America has documented nearly 23,000 book bans in public schools nationwide, a number that is without precedent. During the 2024 to 25 school year alone, so the last complete school year that we had, there were almost 6,900 book bans enacted. And lest you think this is only a red state or blue state kind of problem, these book bans took place in 23 states and in 87 different public school districts. So there is a broader backdrop of this, a broader context, And I think it's important that we keep this in mind to know that in almost every case, the banning of books or the censoring, the deletion of portions of different books or films is something that it's taking place with regard to a lot of topics. And many times it is not just about the Holocaust or necessarily even at all about Jews or anti-Semitism. It's about larger trends, it's about anxieties, about what people are worried about. So let's fast forward in history to the next slide, please. And when we think about book bans or book censorship, many of us immediately are jerked back, perhaps depending on our age, to the Soviet Union. My father was a scholar of Soviet censorship, so this was oddly a topic that we talked about at my kitchen table about what people could read and where. But in terms of Holocaust history, we are more likely to think about something like the image we see here, the Nazi era in Germany, and specifically April 1933, when there were coordinated book burnings all across the country, carefully stage managed and orchestrated for maximum effect in terms of terror and in terms of symbolism. In this photo, we see members of the SA, the Nazi security force, together with university students, and they're looking at piles of books. They're tossing them, they're throwing them, books that have been deemed un-German in the Nazi ideology and that they are going to physically destroy. They will be burned, and we can see in the next slide, burned in bonfires as part of a carefully coordinated spectacle of terror. That when I say it was stage managed, I'm not exaggerating. People were given, and especially university students were given, very specific instructions about how to do a book burning, a sort of how-to handbook, where to stage it, to be sure to have flags, what songs to sing. There were special sayings or slogans called fire oaths that especially members of the Hitler Youth, the youth movement for boys in Nazi Germany, were encouraged to shout. And so this was really designed to do two things. It was both to instill terror and fear, especially in not only Jews, but also among political enemies of the Nazis, like communists or trade unionists. But it was also a deliberate strategy by the Nazi regime to do it primarily on the campuses of universities. And this was very deliberate. They were trying to take places that, to our minds, are locations of academic inquiry, of free intellectual exploration, and to do what the Nazis euphemistically referred to as the consolidation of culture, determining what was in German society and what was on the outside. I won't spend any more time today talking about these book burnings because we could have a whole session just on that. But I do want to remind all of us sitting here today that they were burning the books and artwork and music not only produced by creative minds of Jewish people, artists like Marc Chagall, musicians, but also music, for example, that was deemed in their terms degenerate, which included jazz. I'll give just one literary example. And by the way, I hope all or most of you have access to a source packet, which should have been distributed to you with your registration. There will be a lot of material in there, more than I can cover today, and also with fuller quotes of the kinds of things that I'm going to read aloud. So don't worry about taking notes. If you don't have it, I'm sure we can send it to you afterward. But pretty much anything I'm referencing will be in there. So in the next slide, among the authors whose work was burned on the bonfires in April 1933 was the work of this man, a man known as Felix Salten. Felix Salten was actually an adopted name, not just a pen name. He was born Zygmunt Salzmann. He was an Austrian Jewish author, journalist who lived in Vienna, who changed his name as an adult to something that sounded less obviously Jewish. And he had many, many ambivalent feelings about his Jewish heritage, his Jewish identity. But the reason that he is significant to us, and it might not be a name that you recognize, is that in 1922, he published a book that we will see in the next slide, a book known to you probably more through the movie, a book called Bambi, or in German, Bambi, eine Lebensgeschichte aus dem Wald, translated as Bambi, A Story of Life in the Woods. Many of you may be surprised, as I was when I first learned that Bambi was originally written as an adult novel. I associate it overwhelmingly with the Walt Disney animated movie from the early 1940s, thinking of the heartbreaking baby deer Bambi, whose mother is killed by hunters. Other people have made reference to this book as some kind of environmental or pro-animal rights book, but it was targeted for destruction by the Nazis, not for any of those reasons, but because of its subject matter. Bambi, the book, was targeted not only because its author was Jewish, but because many people read it through that lens and saw it as a parable about the treatment of Jews in Europe over the centuries and particularly during the interwar period. I would love to refer all of you to a great piece in the New Yorker magazine. Came out in January 2022, and I can try to put it in the chat or I'll send it to the Haberman Institute later. But it's a piece that came out in 2022 because that was the year that the copyright expired on Bambi. It had been published 100 years earlier, and so it entered the public domain in copyright terms, and there was a new translation, which showed a lot of the complexity and darkness that appeared in this book. So that is another example of the type of material that was destroyed, physically destroyed and demonized by the Nazi German regime. But I want to turn now to much more recent events and to books that we are more likely, all of us, to have read or have read portions of. And I'm going to start what is really the sort of the greatest hit of Jewish Holocaust literature, to be a little flip about it. But this is absolutely the most widely read book related to the Holocaust, and for many people, it is their first introduction to the topic. It is Anne Frank's The Diary of a Young Girl, and it is a book that has been challenged, edited, redacted, censored, banned many times since it first came out in public form, and in edition in 1947. The diary has now been translated into more than 70 different languages, and it is deemed repeatedly, if you see books that are of, the most influential books of the 20th century, it is almost always on there. It has more than 30 million copies that have been sold in 60 countries, and in fact is even the target of Holocaust deniers very often. If we could go to the next slide, just to give an example of the far-reaching influence of this book, we are looking at a Cambodian woman named Sayana Sarr. Sayana works in human rights advocacy in Cambodia and also in the difficult and painful reckoning that that country has with its own history of genocide, an internal genocide against citizens of Cambodia by members of the Khmer Rouge. Sayana found the Diary of Anne Frank, read it, found it so resonant to her own experience and to the experience of that of her fellow countrymen that she had it translated into the Cambodian language of Khmer. And the next slide shows the copy, which she had published and disseminated around the country. So that is just one example of the unexpected reach and power and resonance of Anne's diary. But the first person to censor and excise passages from the diary was, in fact, Anne Frank herself. From her entry that she wrote in her diary, and actually it's more accurate to say in her diaries because she had more than one journal, which have now been consolidated into the published book. But from the entry that she penned on the 20th of May, 1944, Anne spent the rest of that summer rewriting and rewriting again large portions of her diary. She was a very self-conscious writer, maintaining the diary not just to process her private thoughts in a place where she had no privacy while in physical hiding in Amsterdam, but she also had ambitions. She wanted to be a professional writer after the war, and she planned to publish this book about her time later. She even came up with the title that so many of us use now, The Secret Annex. That was her own title for her planned book. we just saw in a previous slide, and we don't have to go back, but it was of a more recent edition, which is called the definitive version of the diary. And it includes many of the passages that were not present in the edition that I read as a teenager in the 80s, that many of you may have read as students or on your own. And as her cousin, Buddy Elias, described this more expansive, unredacted version of the diary, he said, "It's really her. It shows her in a truer light, not as a saint, but as a girl like every other girl. She was nothing, actually. People try to make a saint out of her and glorify her, but that she was not. She was an ordinary, normal girl with a talent for writing," he said in 1996. Let's go to the next slide, please. So Anne began keeping her diary in 1942, and it was her constant friend. You may recall she referred to her diary by a name. She called her pen pal, her imaginary pen pal, Kitty. And she spent a lot of time writing in it. And then in the final weeks, before the residents of the secret annex were betrayed and captured and deported to concentration camps, she was rewriting large portions of this diary. And of course, she didn't know that they would be betrayed. She didn't know that these were her last weeks and months in this place where she actually had the freedom to write. But in these iterative versions, she was editing, and we can look at the original and then at subsequent versions that she made. She was taking out controversial or explicit passages. So she was the first to sanitize or gloss over her own words. If you have your source packet with you, I would invite you to turn to source number 6. You will see her most famous entry. The quote, I will read a little bit of it so you don't have to go back and forth, or if you don't have it. But this is the most famous quote of Anne Frank, which she wrote in July of 1944. So really just a few weeks, even days before their betrayal. And she said in translation from the Dutch, "It's difficult in times like these. Ideals, dreams, and cherished hopes rise within us only to be crushed by grim reality. It's a wonder I haven't abandoned all my ideals. They seem so absurd and impractical. Yet I cling to them because I still believe, in spite of everything, that people are truly good at heart. I feel the suffering of millions, and yet when I look up at the sky, I somehow feel that everything will change for the better, that this cruelty too shall end, that peace and tranquility will return once more. In the meantime, I must hold on to my ideals. Perhaps the day will come when I'll be able to realize them." Now, when we hear those words and we remember the setting in which they were written by a child, a 15-year-old girl who is physically hiding for her life in terror for years, and hear that she still expresses any form of optimism, some form of hope for the future, it is a very pleasant message to receive. And that is one reason that her diary is such a touchstone as a text. It is, I would say, one of the rare Holocaust texts, a primary source, so from the period itself, written during the Holocaust, not about it later, that actually gives us a kind of redemptive or comforting message. There are many, many dozens of young people's diaries written during the Holocaust that are either not as well written, and Anne's talents are a big part of why the diary is as popular as it is, or they don't have any of this kind of feel-good passage, or they are graphically violent. And those diaries are much less known. I would point all of you to a terrific anthology of these and book about them called Salvaged Pages, written by Alexandra Zapruder. Salvaged Pages, some of you might know Alex Zapruder. She lives locally in DC. And she has resurrected and shown a light on many of these other teenage diaries from the Holocaust. But I'm hoping in the next few minutes to show you some of the ways that Anne's diary was censored, either self-censored or censored by others, to show us and remind us that to reduce Anne Frank to this kind of saccharine version, one who is just saintly, as her cousin Buddy put it, is to really do her an injustice because there is a lot of frustration in her full diary. There are complicated emotions that teenagers have. I am a mom of teenagers. There are a lot of days where you have arguments with your mother and she writes about them. And there are also parts where, frankly, she comes across as sort of self-absorbed or even spoiled. So, in short, she's a human being. We could go to the next slide. Just as a side note, I have sometimes wondered, and I have no proof for this, but I have wondered sometimes if another factor contributing to the popularity of Anne Frank is that her name is easy to pronounce. It's not a notably Jewish name, and it works in a lot of different languages. So just a theory, but I throw it out there. Now, I imagine that many of you might have read in the press that a few years ago, additional writings by Anne were recovered using forensic techniques from her diary. That's not what I'm showing you here. I'll get to this in a minute. This, if you have visited the Anne Frank house in Amsterdam, is a page from a women's magazine that she had up on the wall. She pasted a bunch of magazine torn out pages to the area where she slept in the secret annex. But anyway, as I was saying, using these forensic techniques, they discovered that there were things that she did not want her family to see, and that Anne had covered parts of her diary with brown paper, so it just looked like a lining inside the covers and other parts, and underneath it, she had written a bunch of off-color jokes. I included one of them in your packet as source number 4. This is one of the more recently recovered diary entries, and she put this in September 1942. So she was a 13-year-old girl, being, a little off color, a little edgy. This was her joke. She said, "I'll use this spoiled page to write down dirty jokes," she put in quotes. "Do you know why the German Wehrmacht girls are in the Netherlands, the German army girls? As mattresses for the soldiers." So this is a pretty sexualized joke. It's a form of resistance, and it is a not atypical form we can see in many diaries from the Holocaust and in many ghetto archives that humor, and especially edgy humor, was a form of spiritual resistance for Jews who found themselves in unbearable circumstances. And because this is a webinar, I cannot hear if anybody laughed at the joke or any of my jokes, so I apologize if they're not landing. But it is certainly a far cry from the kind of cheery, inspirational, "I believe people are good at heart." She's being a little subversive here. Now, probably the most frequently censored segment, or the reason that people in America object to the expanded edition of Anne Frank's diary, has to do with things that she wrote that were very explicit about her changing body, for example, getting her period in the secret annex, exploring her own sexuality. She was going through very typical adolescent changes, both physical and emotional, but in a totally abnormal setting. In your source packet, I included a very long excerpt, which I will not read aloud in the interest of time, but it is number 7 in your packet, from a diary entry that she wrote on January 5th, 1944. So again, number 7 in your source packet. Anne liked to read magazines, and in particular, the helpers who took care of the Franks and the others who were in hiding in the secret annex, along with bringing them food and other necessary supplies. When possible, they would also bring them reading material for entertainment. And one of the magazines that was frequently brought to them was a popular women's magazine called Libelle, Libelle. It is actually still a weekly magazine in the Netherlands. You can still read it. I would say it's kind of like a cross between Glamour magazine and Real Simple. It contains fashion tips, cleaning, advice column, recipes, and Anne really liked this magazine and would, as I said, put up things that she tore out, pinups from movie stars she liked, things she thought that were fashionable. She would stick them on her wall. But one of Anne's favorite aspects of Libelle was the column that I think that'll go away if you just click back and forth, was the column that was written by a woman named Sis Heister. Sis Heister was a known psychologist who wrote pretty progressive pieces about womanhood and girlhood, and Anne really loved them. And in the excerpt that I put in your source manual or source packet, she talks about an article she read that Sis Heister talks about blushing, about how your face turns red when you're embarrassed, and about teenage girls who might feel self-conscious about the changes in their bodies. And she describes how she actually felt very proud to get her period. She was embracing becoming a woman. She liked the changes that were happening to her. And the passage that is most often a flashpoint for upset parents in the United States is that Anne writes, and this was not in the edition that I read as a teenager. I know I wouldn't have forgotten. She was talking about a memory from before going into hiding when she was feeling physically attracted toward a female friend of hers, that she wanted to kiss her. She did kiss her. She wanted to touch her breasts. And this passage has often become the reason that parents or conservative groups who don't want to have any kind of sexual references appear in classrooms, that they single out Anne Frank or else sweep it up in a broader sweep of books that they want to ban. I remember when I first started working at the Holocaust Museum that I actually was sort of caught off guard by some teenage girls who were visiting the museum from out of state, asking me as their first question if it was true that Anne Frank was a lesbian. And I didn't know at that time what they were talking about. I had not read that newer edition, had come out since I was a student. And I remember just sort of thinking, I'm not sure that they're really getting the point of the book if that's the part that they feel is most significant, but it caught their attention. Now, according to the American Library Association, The Diary of Anne Frank is consistently among the most banned books of the past 10 years. It's not in the top 20, it's not even in the top 50, but it's usually around the top 60. And that shows a consistent pattern. It has been banned in a number of schools, it's been eliminated or removed from school libraries, mostly in regard to passages that were considered sexually offensive. But also, I want to highlight for you for the tragic nature of the book, which some felt might be depressing for young readers or overwhelming. Um, the first time that it was banned that I've been able to find was in 1982, which is actually fairly early in the teaching of Holocaust history, Holocaust studies in American public schools. Some parents of children in Wise County in Virginia complained. But one of the things that really struck me was in the mid 80s, the book had been flagged, the diary had been flagged in Alabama, and members of an official state committee called for the rejection of the diary because, and I quote, they said, "It is a real downer," end quote. Now, interestingly, some educators I know don't like the Diary of Anne Frank as a teaching tool because they feel actually, in a way, it's not enough of a downer. Anne is, of course, in mortal danger, uh, in danger of being discovered at any time. But for a primary source Holocaust document, her diary actually doesn't contain any violence or any real brutality. It's just the threat of it, the crushing threat of it. And many of the other diaries that I described are actually written in ghettos, or are written immediately after the war by survivors of concentration camps. So in some way, the Diary of Anne Frank is a document that exists out of time and out of space. It's a sort of Holocaust fairy tale, almost in a way, with, of course, a very tragic and horrible ending. Now, one of the last things I want to say, because I have a few other books, of course, I want to talk to you about, was that a couple of years ago, recently in Culpeper County, Virginia, which is a short drive from where I live in Washington, D.C., a lone parent, single parent, complained that the Diary of Anne Frank had sexually explicit material in it and specifically objected to what they deemed homosexual themes. And the school district stopped assigning it. I want to bring this up because it's indicative of a much more dangerous trend, not unique just to Holocaust teaching, but that we are seeing around the US that one or two very vocal parents, and they may be politically conservative or they might be politically liberal, but if they see something that makes them uncomfortable, it can cause a lot of problems. I want to close this section about Anne Frank by having us hear in a moment from her father, Otto. Otto Frank survived the war. He was the only member of his nuclear family to survive. His wife and his two daughters, Anne and her older sister, Margot, were all killed or all died. One of their rescuers, a Dutch woman named Miep Gies, Gies, had kept Anne's journals and other writings for safekeeping. And when Otto returned to Amsterdam after the war, she gave them to him. Otto had some editorial choices to make before he submitted the diary for publication, but first he had to read it. So let's hear from him briefly in an interview from 1967.
Except for one thing. Miep had kept for him something the Gestapo had thrown away as rubbish when they ransacked the secret annex.
I knew that Anna wrote a diary. She spoke about her diary. She left her diary with me at night in a briefcase next to my bed. I had promised her never to look in. I never did. When I returned, and after I had the news that my children would not come back, Miep gave me the diary, which had been saved by, I should say, a miracle. It took me a very long time to read it. And I must say, I was very much surprised about the deep thoughts Anna had, her seriousness, especially her self-criticism. It was quite a different Anna I had known as my daughter. She never really showed this kind of inner feeling. She talked about many things, we criticized many things, but what really their feelings were, I only could see from the diary. And my conclusion is, as I had been in very, very good terms with Anna, that most parents don't know really their children. And so I know, too, that in reading the diary, parents and teachers will learn a lot. To build up a future, you have to know the past. You see, I'm pretty old now, but I am not a bitter man. Young people write to me, asking questions. Many are writing a diary themselves, calling their diary Anna's diary. They write to Anna as Anna wrote to Kitty. And so, especially in the time of adolescence, they get a lot of confidence and hope for their lives in reading about Anna and her experiences.
So I think it's really powerful to hear from Otto Frank in his own words, and he did not give very many interviews. This one, as I mentioned, was in 1967, and it appeared in a show that some of you may have heard of called The Eternal Light, which first was a radio show produced by my alma mater, JTS, the Jewish Theological Seminary, and then there were some episodes on TV like this one as a co-production of JTS and the NBC television network. One thing I think we should keep in mind, and that might be interesting for you if you do go back to read the book after so long, and if you look at the definitive version, perhaps you've not read it, is to remind ourselves that we are looking at iterations of a diary written by a young person who is maturing in the course of writing it. And so when I said that Anne herself was her first censor, it's not just that she cut out or glossed over things that were too messy or too ugly for her to put in what she hoped would be her future book. But we also have to recall that when she goes back to edit herself, by the summer of 1944, she's a 15-year-old girl looking back at what she wrote when she was 13. And that is a big age difference at that stage in development. I would challenge any of us to look and see things that we wrote at younger ages that don't make us cringe in some way. So she had changing sensibilities, and it reflects that. And Otto Frank had a number of editorial choices to make. He at first had to decide whether he wanted to submit the diary for publication, if he did so to honor Anne's wishes or for the betterment of the world. It first came out actually in West Germany, then in the Netherlands, and only later in the US. But he was thinking about also protecting the privacy or the more intimate, painful memories of his two murdered daughters and his wife, none of whom was able to weigh in on what version of their lives would be presented, and also what would be palatable to an audience, as there was certainly no guarantee as early as 1947 that any publisher would take on a project like this or that there would be any public appetite for it. So that's a lot about Anne Frank, but for many people, she is the Holocaust. She is their introduction, and sometimes she is their end. So I think it's worthy of attention. In the next slide, though, I want to turn a little bit to TV and movies, because it's not only books about the Holocaust that have drawn objections, but also the moving image. We see here pictured Meryl Streep, who would later win an Oscar in 1982 for her portrayal of a traumatized Polish woman after World War II in Sophie's Choice, which is both a novel and a film that deal with Holocaust themes. But here, this is a poster for 1978's four-part TV miniseries, just called Holocaust, simply called Holocaust. And it won a lot of Emmys. It too appeared on NBC. I know that I remember watching it with my family as a kid, even though in retrospect, I was way too young to be watching it, but maybe that explains how I ended up in this line of work. Also, my dad was a Holocaust survivor. I don't think it occurred to him to shield children from things that he had experienced as a child. But you'll see briefly here this quote next to it, an excerpt from a review of Holocaust, the miniseries, by Tom Shales, who was the longtime TV critic for the Washington Post. And he wrote on April 16th, 1978, and this is number 10 in your source packet if you want to look at it later. He said, "Television, the good news machine, departs from its role as national comforter tonight when NBC begins the 4-night telecast of Holocaust, a 9.5-hour filmed drama on one of the most discomforting of all possible topics, Nazi persecution and extermination of Jews in the 1930s and 40s. It is hard to imagine television drama more demanding or rewarding." And Shales went on to write, "For years, TV has taken subjects that seemed to defy sugarcoating and turned them into mind snacks. Subjects like death, for instance, depicted as everything from cute to noble, but never quite ghastly. The people who made Holocaust are shrewd dramatists, and they tell absorbing, interwoven stories about fictitious, believable people that hold one's interest through almost every minute of the 450-minute film. But they have not, to their great credit, minimized or trivialized the reality of horror against which these lives are led." End quote. I think now it would be called a limited series. And since people very rarely watch live television anymore, they're more likely to stream. It would be harder to know the impact, how many people watch all of it. But it was really a big deal to bring it into people's living rooms. And it foretold what we'll see in the next slide, which is, I imagine, recognizable to many of you as the most iconic image from the 1993 film Schindler's List. Now, I want to remind you or tell you, if you're not familiar, that Schindler's List was originally a novel published in 1982, originally with the title Schindler's Ark, like Noah's Ark, written by a very, very prolific Australian author named Thomas Keneally. And although the book is fiction, the character of Oskar Schindler was, of course, a real person, an ethnic German born in what is now the Czech Republic. The novel was awarded the Booker Prize that year, one of the highest literary honors in the world, and Schindler is a flawed hero. He was an alcoholic businessman who profited from collaboration with the Nazi German regime. Oskar Schindler was a Nazi Party member. He was a womanizer, an opportunist, and at first a really reluctant rescuer who did not have solely pure motives, but also saw the opportunity to profit from free slave laborers in the form of Jewish prisoners at the Plaszow concentration camp in occupied Poland, not far from the city of Krakow. And incidentally, if you've not been to Poland, or if you have, perhaps you remember, you can visit Schindler's enamelware factory, which is now a museum. Interestingly, the factory was originally established by 3 Polish Jewish entrepreneurs. And so we have Schindler's List. It is this iconic film. 25 million people see it in the theaters when it originally comes out in 1993. But in 1997, it was broadcast on TV. And TV starts taking on this role of teaching and shaping for the American public a widely shared understanding of the horrors of the Holocaust, whether in fictionalized form or true history like Anne Frank. NBC aired Schindler's List on a Sunday night without commercial interruption, which was really extraordinary to do. And 65 million people, which represented almost a quarter of the United States population at the time, tuned in to watch. Nielsen ratings, which would see what the viewership was for different TV shows, showed that more than a third of American homes who were watching television that night tuned in to watch Schindler's List. Now, interestingly, as a side note, the broadcast, because it's commercial TV, and they have to make profits, and that's why they have advertisements. They needed advertising dollars. And so the ad-free broadcast was actually sponsored by the Ford Motor Company, which was very interesting and perhaps a sort of penance, given that Ford's company founder, Henry Ford, was one of the most vocal and vicious anti-Semites in the United States in the 1920s and 30s, republishing and distributing a version of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, using his newspaper published in Dearborn, Michigan, as a mouthpiece for some of the most hateful rhetoric about Jews. But NBC, their ability to show this film was made possible by Ford Motor Company. Still, not everyone was thrilled. Okay, and in your source packet, source number 11 is an excerpt from an official statement issued by then Congressman Tom Coburn from Oklahoma, who at the time was chairman of the Congressional Family Caucus. And he said, in part, right after the broadcast of Schindler's List, that broadcast was, and I quote, an all-time low, with full frontal nudity, violence, and profanity being shown in our homes. The fact that it aired on public television on a Sunday evening during a family time should outrage parents and decent-minded individuals everywhere. I cringe when I realize that there were children all across this nation watching this program. They were exposed to the violence of multiple gunshot head wounds, vile language, full frontal nudity, and irresponsible sexual activity. It simply should not have been allowed on public television, end quote. Now, I will say that Congressman Coburn very quickly came to regret issuing this statement. He was even called to task on the floor of Congress very quickly, and he backpedaled, he apologized, and he said he was wrong. But I think the objection that he made to Schindler's List kind of gets to the crux of what a lot of objections are about Holocaust material, that it's brutal, that it's a lot of unpleasantness, it's violent. The full frontal nudity to which he is referring is degrading. It's not sexy or prurient. It was designed to be dehumanizing. And at its base, thinking about the Holocaust, learning about it, remembering it, documenting it is extremely uncomfortable. I feel like I use that word a lot when discussing this topic, but it is uncomfortable to watch, to read, to hear about it, and it should be. And that also delayed people's receptivity to hearing directly from survivors themselves. And for that, I'd like to turn to our next case study, the next slide, which is about this book, the second most popular book about the Holocaust, Elie Wiesel's Night. Now, Night is, if you've not read it, or if it's been many years since you've read it, It is usually defined as a memoir, but it is also stylistically written in a very artistic form, where Wiesel has created a character of Eliezer, his same name, his same original name, to be the narrator, and it shows his wartime experience and the fate of his family. Now, when it was published in the US first in 1960, Knight had a first print run of 3,000 books, and it took 3 years to sell that print run. So 3 years, 3,000 books. But by 1997, after the emergence of Holocaust studies as an academic field, and after its integration into more school curricula in the 1970s and 80s, Knight had become a very popular book, especially in schools, and it was selling around 300,000 copies a year, which certainly wasn't hurt by the fact that Wiesel had been awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature for it in 1986. But the real turning point that skyrocketed Knight into the stratosphere was in 2006, after being selected by Oprah Winfrey, the original influencer, having Elie Wiesel on her show, and then selecting it as a title for her book club. It sat comfortably, Knight sat comfortably in the #1 spot on the New York Times bestseller list in its category for a year and a half. A year and a half, #1. And last time I checked, it had sold over 10 million copies and continues to be one of the most widely taught texts in the classroom. But it is also not without controversy, and it has become a flashpoint, a lightning rod as well. So I want us to go back a little bit, and I'm going to show you some of the evolution of this book, ways that it too has been edited, sanitized, shortened to make it digestible to a broader audience of people. In 1954, and let's go to the next slide, and we will see an image of a young Elie Wiesel before he had his signature shock of gray hair. A young Elie Wiesel in 1954 was on board a ship sailing from France to Brazil. He was a working journalist at the time and was on a reporting trip. And this is just 9 years after the liberation. And he wrote down his memoirs, as he later said, and I quote, "to testify, to stop the dead from dying, to justify my own survival." Later in that trip, Wiesel found himself in Buenos Aires, and he gave his manuscript, which he had originally written in the Yiddish language, he gave it to a publisher named Mark Turkov, who published it in Yiddish in 1956 under the title Und die Welt hat geschwiegen, which means, and the world remained silent. Wiesel realized he wanted it to have a broader audience. He reworked his account, as many writers do. He cut it down heavily by more than half so that it could be published and have a reception, be received well in a French version called La Nuit. And we can go to the next slide and see covers of these two. On the left, the Yiddish and Die Welt hat geschwiegen, and on the right, an early edition of La Nuit, the night. Even the titles tell you something. The world remained silent, the world was silent, is a sort of accusatory title, an angrier title. La Nuit, you can't really tell what night is about. It's a kind of vague, opaque title. Now, it's enigmatic, it's sort of abstract. Wiesel had said, and he gave many interviews, as you know, I'm sure many of you may have heard him speak. He was a very, very powerful public speaker. He had said that he thought he needed to wait 10 years after the liberation to kind of let his brain assimilate and digest all that he had experienced, all that he had lost, all that he learned had happened. But the Yiddish version has a totally different, very raw accounting of it. He writes actually that he started jotting down notes almost immediately after the liberation when he was staying in the infirmary at the just liberated Buchenwald concentration camp, and that he's in bed for several days. And he started jotting down notes So the Yiddish version is much less apologetic, much more immediate. Now, in your source packet, I have number 13 for you, a long excerpt, which I will not read to you because it's too long, but it is from a man named Georges Borchardt, who was Elie Wiesel's longtime literary agent. And Borchardt was the one who pushed for it to be translated and published in the United States. And he talked about how difficult it was to find a publisher, an American publisher, that would accept it. They did not like the content. Publishers, including many Jewish-owned publishing houses like Simon and Schuster, other big heavyweight publishing houses, Dutton, Knopf, Scribner's, all of them said no. They said this book is not for us. We're not going to publish it, but it does eventually come out. I want to give you just a few very specific examples to show how the context and the language in which it is written changed the tenor, the voice, and even the content of Night. And if you do have your source packet, you could look at number 17. I'm going to be just doing 3 sentences for you. And if you don't have it there or you'd rather not look back and forth, do not worry. So in the most common English translation, which is translated by a woman named Stella Rodway, there is this brief passage. He's talking about, Wiesel is talking about after the liberation, and he describes that some survivors who are living in displaced persons camp are in need, they're hungry. And here is what he wrote. Quote, "Early the next day, Jewish boys ran off to Weimar. They only thought about food, not about revenge, not about their parents, only about bread. And even when they had satisfied their hunger, they still did not think about revenge. So food and revenge." Now I'm going to give you 3 different versions of the same passage. The first is from 1956, from the Yiddish version. And it says, and I'm translating for you, "Early the next day, Jewish boys ran off to Weimar, the town of Weimar, to steal clothing and potatoes, and to rape German girls." In Yiddish, it said, "Und zu vergewaltigen deutsche Schicksals." The historical commandment of revenge was not fulfilled. In French, in the version in La Nuit, it said, "Le lendemain, quelques jeunes gens coururent à Weimar, ramassaient des pommes de terre et des habits et couchaient avec des filles. Mais de vengeance, pas de trace." And to translate that into English, and it appeared identically in the English and the French, "On the following morning, some of the young men went to Weimar to get some potatoes and clothes, and to sleep with girls, but of revenge, not a sign." So in the Yiddish version, it describes bitter, angry, vengeful, desperate young men who run off to the nearby town to steal clothing, to steal food, and to rape German girls, who are referred to by the pejorative term for non-Jewish girls as shiksas. And it says that the historical commandment of revenge was not fulfilled. In the French and English versions, it's been sanitized. It says they went to get some potatoes, to get some clothes, and to sleep with girls. But it doesn't show it as an aggressive or violent act. It describes it as though maybe they're sowing their wild oats or they're having fun with willing girls, but they're not rapists. They're not attacking. They are not angry. And this is just a very typical comparison of these different versions and who it's written for and the tone that Wiesel wanted it to have. I want to point you to a terrific article by a scholar named Naomi Seidman, Seidman. I have a quote from her in your source packet as well. She wrote a much more extensive article that I have relied on about the repression of anger and revenge in Night and comparing the different versions. But the book, the one that came out in the 90s, and then another one that quotes from the more full version have generated controversy here in the US. And on the next slide, we have a discussion. This is number 14 in your source sheet, but I'll read a little bit of it to you. This is from a very popular books website and app now called Goodreads, where book lovers and readers compare notes, make recommendations, give reviews of books. And a parent wrote about his or her kid reading Night in class and said, "I am very upset that this book, Night, is on a list of as appropriate for 14-year-old eighth graders. Because it is, my son is being forced to read it by his school. My family is deeply affected by this book. My son is in emotional upheaval and very depressed. This book should not be listed as appropriate for this age group. It should be read at the high school level and up and be listed as so. How could a book like this end up on the list?" And there was a reply from another reader named John, who points out that Elie Wiesel was younger than your son when he experienced the events in Night. Think about that. Of course, part of education, perhaps the most important part, is learning about and confronting history. Hiding from it is not healthy. And I think that this exchange encapsulates yet again that this is a book where people are not objecting to it because of sexual content, but just that it's very disturbing. It is upsetting. It is painful to read about deportations, to read about conditions in the Auschwitz-Birkenau killing center where Elie was a young child, Elie, a young teen, was imprisoned with his father, or to read about a death march. And I think that sometimes in what we are seeing now in the United States is the spread of orthodoxies of all kinds. And I hope this makes you feel a little dis-ease, whether you're on the political right or the political left, that we don't want to feel uncomfortable, that increasingly we live in echo chambers of information and attitudes with which we agree, and that things that make us feel bad about ourselves or make us question our values or are disturbing to that worldview are not welcomed. And I think that objections tonight often fall into that category. There was a new edition, another edition of Night that came out in 2006, which was translated by Elie's longtime translator, his wife, Marion. May she rest in peace. She just passed away last year. And Marion Wiesel said that some of the changes in the descriptions were, for example, a wording change about some sexual activity that occurred between young people as they traveled during the many days or week-long trip to Auschwitz in a cattle car. Marion Wiesel said that the original English translation had used the word copulate to describe what they did, which may be upsetting to think about, that people in this terrible situation would be having sex, but also it was a comfort that couldn't be taken away from them in this setting where they had no food, no water, no toilet. That word, copulate, was in later printings changed to say flirt. And in the 2006 translation, it has changed to say that the youths caressed one another. So we are seeing, depending on the sentiments of the time, the ways that translation is really an art, not a science, that the sensibilities of the reader are considered there. I want to go to the next slide because I want to leave some time for questions. And I have one more big example. Actually, yeah, let me just show you this. So these are examples of two books. So far, what I've been talking about have been memoirs or diaries other than the two movies or the TV show. These are two books that are not exactly reference books. They're sort of textbooks or youth level, teen level history books that were designed. Some of you may recall the Time Life series of books that would cover kind of great topics in US history or world history or science, and they'd be primers, introductory books. These are books, The Apparatus of Death and a book about Holocaust resistance, that were removed from school libraries across the state of Missouri just a few years ago in 2022. And they were removed because of an amendment in the state Senate that said that there could be criminal penalties if a person in Missouri who was affiliated with a school, either a teacher or an administrator or a librarian, was giving out any kind of material that might have sexually explicit content. So in the next slide is that there are hundreds and hundreds of books, including Art Spiegelman's Mouse, which I will use my remaining time to talk about, that are removed from school districts across Missouri. And those books that I just showed you, the nonfiction covers that I just showed you, likely had in them photographs, let's say, of emaciated, undressed people, camp prisoners naked or in various states of undress at liberation, or piles of naked corpses. That's not sexual in any way, but it's what I would think of as the sledgehammer versus scalpel approach to censoring or objecting to Holocaust material, that oftentimes the Holocaust material gets swept up in a bigger trend of trying to remove anything that might be upsetting to young people or age inappropriate. And other times in the scalpel approach, it is specific to that book. And the example of that I want to give before I open up to questions is the book Mouse. And in your source guide, by the way, there is the full text of this 2022 Missouri Senate bill. It's source number 12, if you want to read its full text. In a sort of catch-22 that year, the governor of Missouri also signed into law a statewide Holocaust education mandate. So these were two competing laws or bills or mandates that left teachers and librarians in a very tenuous situation where they were betwixt and between. So they're not supposed to show things that might have naked people in them, but they are required to talk about the Holocaust. Or they're not supposed to teach about anything that is graphically violent, but they're supposed to talk about killing centers and ghettos and brutal beatings and Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. So the absurdity of a lot of this really cannot be overstated. But let's talk about Art Spiegelman's Mouse. Now, I'm guessing if you signed up for this webinar that you have an interest in the Holocaust. You are probably likely to be familiar with Mouse, but perhaps you are not. So I will just briefly say that if you are like my husband, who despite my many complaints has never read Mouse, Mouse is typically described as a graphic novel. I don't think of it as a graphic novel because it's really a memoir told in sort of cartoon form by the writer and illustrator Art Spiegelman. It first came out as 2 volumes, Mouse 1, with a subtitle of My Father Bleeds History, and Mouse 2, subtitled And Here My Troubles Began. And now it is also available as a single combined volume called The Complete Mouse, and it's spelled M-A-U-S, the German way. So if you've not read Mouse, and we can go to a next slide, I'm going to show you what's inside. Well, actually, yeah, let me just introduce this clip, and then we'll do that. In 2022, a school board, a local school board, and I'll remind you that under US law, unlike most of the world, there is no national curriculum for K through 12 schools. Educational standards are generally left to local school boards. They have great discretion over curriculum, and they can make decisions as long as they are within constitutional guidelines. So in that system, the McMinn County School Board in Tennessee in 2022 voted specifically to stop using Mouse as a text in their 8th grade curriculum on several grounds, but particularly because they felt it contained sexually inappropriate material. And let's watch this brief clip to see what happened when they banned the book.
From banned in schools to the bestseller list, it's been quite a week for the Holocaust graphic novel Mouse, hitting #1 on Amazon. Using mice and cats as stand-ins for Jews and Nazis, the book depicts how author Art Spiegelman's parents survived the Auschwitz concentration camp. Last month, it was voted out of the curriculum for 13-year-olds by a school board in eastern Tennessee, deemed too adult due to profanity and nudity. Booksellers, educators, and politicians in Tennessee jumped to the book's defense.
It was really hard to hear. It's such a valuable tool for helping our kids learn about a very difficult time.
My initial thought was anger, just because I know how powerful that book can be. It is hard to tell the story of the Holocaust without depictions of violence.
In response to the ban, one comic book shop in the nearby town of Knoxville raised tens of thousands of dollars to give away free copies of Maus to any student who wants one.
That's a small thing that we can do to raise awareness and spread education. People need to be educated.
Maus was already a widely acclaimed story of survival. In 1992, it became the first and so far only graphic novel to win a Pulitzer Prize. Now, as a result of being removed from a handful of schools, it is being read by more people than ever.
So if we can go to the next slide, we have this paradox effect where the banning or making something forbidden makes it actually even more attractive, especially to teens. I mentioned earlier, I have a teen and a college-age kid. Anyone watching this has been a teenager or is a teenager, and you know that the minute something is prohibited, the more appealing it is. So thank you to those people. More people read Maus. If you have not read it, and I would encourage you to read it, although it is very heavy, despite the medium of comics, all of the characters are drawn as animals. So the Jewish characters are portrayed as mice, as anthropomorphized mice. So they have mouse heads, but they stand erect like human beings and have hands and wear clothing. The Jewish characters are mice. The Germans are portrayed as cats. American soldiers are portrayed as dogs, and Polish people and Jews who collaborated, capos in the camps, are portrayed as pigs. So many people were perplexed about the complaint about nudity when all of the characters, all of the illustrations in the book are animals. The book's author, Art Spiegelman, told the New York Times that it seemed like the school board was asking, why can't they teach a nicer Holocaust? And I think that is true of a lot of the things that we've been discussing so far. I want to be clear that the few panels I'm going to be showing you are not sequential in the book. I just took a few different excerpts to give you examples. So here you can see the Jewish mouse, the German woman is a cat, and behind her in a helmet is an American liberator as a dog. Let's go to the next slide. So I want to show you here in the one that's down on the bottom right, where you see a scene of violence. This is very typical of what the scenes look like where there is violence in Maus. It's so cartoonish that the person who's being hit with a punch, it's written out as crack, the kind of, bam, pow, slam noise via writing that you would see in an old-time Superman or Spider-Man or Marvel cartoon. So it is cartoony in many ways, but of course its subject matter is anything but cartoony. Really what the book is Art Spiegelman's attempt to describe, process, show through the medium that is his life's work, what it was like to grow up as the child and eventually the adult child of two exceptionally damaged and wounded and scarred people. His parents had such terrible Holocaust experience, including the loss of their only child, who had been born before the war. Art is born after the war. And so he is showing that this extremely heavy, complicated material, but using illustrations. Next slide, please. So this is the slide that was most focused in on, zoomed in on by the people who wanted the book removed from the curriculum. Art Spiegelman's life story, his mother, after years of mental illness and sitting with this unbearable trauma, she died by suicide by taking pills and slitting her wrists. And this is the image that people found particularly objectionable because it shows his father in the absolutely horrifying scene, which really happened, of finding his dead wife in a bathtub. You can see he's standing in a pool of blood, and her bare breasts are drawn in the comic. Now, I find it beyond belief that people would look at this kind of image in the context of this book and knowing what it is depicting and feel that the cartoon breasts are the most upsetting or disturbing part of the image, rather than the psychological damage inflicted on this woman, and all that she endured and what it drove her to do. The next slide. And I do want to point out that Art Spiegelman has written and drawn comics for a variety of places, Mad magazines, a lot of kind of alternative or subversive places. And people in the Tennessee School Board did a little research into him and fixated on this, and in particular talked about the fact that Spiegelman had drawn cartoons over the years for Playboy magazine. And so they use this as evidence that Maus must somehow be pornographic, that he is a pornographer, and that he has now written this book that is, sneaking pornographic material into their 8th grade class. The reason that I bring this up is that it also plays into much older tropes, that anti-Semitic tropes that portray Jewish men in particular as sexual predators, as preying on innocent Christian women or children, as pedophiles, as rapists, as sexual brutes. And even if the people saying it didn't know or were not aware consciously of those tropes, that they have been internalized into a lot of Christian anti-Semitism and might resonate with people in that way. Before we close, I just want to show these last 2 slides, and you have these, if they're small on your screen, you have them in your source packet in source 21 and 22. It shows Art Spiegelman, or the character of Artie, as a mouse, because he's Jewish, sitting at an artist's drawing board. So this is the present when he's drawing it. And while he is drawing with dead corpses around him. We can even go to the next slide too, so people can see some, but look in your source book. He is surrounded by ghosts, the shadows of the atrocities of the Holocaust, and he's being approached by media, and you can see based on the masks they are wearing what nationalities they are. So one is a German journalist, he's wearing a mask of a cat, and there's a dog-faced American reporter saying, "Tell our viewers what message you want them to get from our book." And the character of Artie, the cartoonist, says, "A message? I don't know." Like he's just trying to sort out his own painful feelings. And he's pushed to talk about German guilt. He's pushed to talk about corporations that existed in Nazi Germany and if they're profiting now. And then there is a Jewish journalist say, "Let's talk about Israel." Everyone is trying to hijack this conversation and make the book about what they want. When for Spiegelman, it was really just a very painful personal reckoning. So let's close. Let's go to my last slide. This is a picture that is literally close to home. This is a picture of, see, if we were in a classroom, I would say, "What is it? Can you recognize it?" But it is here in Washington, D.C. It is a picture of Jackson Reed High School, which is the flagship public high school in Washington. And full disclosure that one of my children was a student there for a couple of years. I bring this up because I feel like most of the examples that I've given have come from clumsy overreach. Most of the recent examples of censorship or banning have come from clumsy overreach from conservatives on the political right. But increasingly, we are seeing attacks on Holocaust literature and the teaching of these books coming from people who would call themselves progressives on the left. As an example of this, in November 2023, so within just a couple of weeks, I think 3 weeks after the horrific terror attacks in Israel of October 7th, the Jackson Reed student newspaper, The Chronicle, reported that the sophomore year English curriculum had been restructured due to what they called, quote, sensitivity surrounding the Israel-Palestine conflict. And I'm quoting, students were scheduled to begin their second unit directly after the events of October 7th, where they would read Knight and Mouse, two memoirs that depict the events of the Holocaust. Teachers met with assistant principal Mark Minsker, who oversees the English department, to discuss delaying Knight and Mouse. And the principal said that teachers were struggling how to teach because the conflict is a sensitive topic right now. The department decided to postpone reading the books until tensions decreased. End quote. I and many other parents at the school were very upset about this, but we should not be surprised. Data from the American Library Association shows that the majority of book censorship attempts now are actually originating from organized movements, not just from lone parents who are, flying off the handle. Pressure groups and also government entities that include elected officials, school board members, and administrators actually initiated 72% of the demands to censor books in school and public libraries in the last year. So, lest we think we are just talking about some fringe opinions or sensibilities that have evolved over time, I think we need to really be on guard to protect the truth of this history and truthful reckonings with it. So, thank you for your patience if you're still there, and I will turn to Matt for questions.
Thank you, Dr. Friedberg, for such a thoughtful and illuminating presentation. And yes, everybody is still here with us, so that's wonderful. And
Amazing.
and so for those of you with questions, please feel free to continue to enter them in the Q&A now. And we hope you'll stay with us for the questioning. Your last point there were actually a couple of related questions. I don't know if you have more of the same, but there were a couple of questions relating the narratives of Israel and Hamas today. And one person noted, is it also a question of a denial of the Jewish experience and failure to credit Jewish voices? The same is true now of the testimony of women and men murdered, kidnapped, and sexually abused by Hamas.
I would say it depends on a case-by-case basis. I think more of the recent objections that I didn't go into so much because they are still either being reported or are winding their way through official protest channels are emanating from the left and from an impulse to discredit and not want to pay attention to the voices of Jewish victims. In some ways, we are seeing what is almost an unfortunate side effect of the success of Holocaust education, that so many people, especially those with college degrees or above in the United States, have been exposed to Holocaust history, that they are experiencing what many in Germany experienced even a generation earlier, sort of Holocaust fatigue, a sense that, yes, we've been hearing about this for so long. We get it. It was terrible. Everyone hates the Jews. You deserve sympathy all the time, would go this narrative, and a whataboutism. What about the neglect of fill in the blank? And they may not be wrong. Attention to slavery, violence against LGBTQ people, the oppression of women, attitudes towards immigrants. There are many kinds of hatred, unfortunately, in our society. And in part because of the success of Jewish communal actors and many Holocaust survivors who are brave enough to share their testimony, the Holocaust has probably gotten disproportionate attention compared to some of the other groups. But the reaction against that is sometimes so extreme as to seek to erase any mention of what happened at the Holocaust and to only cast Jews as being privileged and white and wealthy. So stereotypes about Jews that have existed for a long time, that they are powerful, that they are rich, that they are manipulative, are now being adapted and deployed to silence teaching about the Holocaust or even see it as a form of aggression by Jews.
Thank you. There's a couple of questions here about the different translations, and One is probably maybe a short answer, but is there an English translation of the Yiddish version and the world remains silent?
So I've looked and looked. I haven't been able to find a complete English translation. Probably the best um, way to look at least sort of side by side at the changes in the parallel versions is to go to the article that I mentioned by Naomi Seidman. And you have that in your source packet, the journal in which it appeared. It's an academic journal, so you're less likely to have seen it. It's not complete, and also the original Yiddish version was, I believe, around 240 or 250 pages long. So there's a lot that is left on the cutting room floor. In some ways, it was a first draft, and it's not only a change in tenor or content, but also uh, just part of the editing process of making it more readable, of consistent themes. But to my knowledge, there isn't a definitive Yiddish version translated word for word. But look at the Naomi Seidman article if you want to see some of the changes. There's also, and Matt, if you'll remind me later, a couple of other articles I can send you from the New York Times and elsewhere that speak to some of the things that have been changed. Like I mentioned, the sexual interaction on a deportation train, where that came from, and how it has been taken out, changed, slightly worded differently.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, we'll be happy to include all the links in our follow-up email. And if anybody had issues with the link that we put in the PowerPoint, I mean in this presentation chat, we'll definitely include it in any follow-up emails.
Matt, I could go back for a second, sorry, because I feel I didn't address the latter part of that first question about the silencing or even negation of women's voices around the October 7th attacks. And we have seen, really despicable disregard for women who were the targets and men, both on October 7th and subsequently people who were held hostage in Gaza who were subjected to repeated sexual assault and sexual violence. And that groups around the world who claim to be watchdogs and voices for victims of sexual violence have ignored or denied them. I would say that in some ways it mirrors for me some of what we saw actually in terms of Holocaust scholarship and the voices of women survivors from the war. Although, of course, during the Holocaust, men and boys were also sexually abused. I mean, this was a time of brutality and chaos of all kinds. I'll give as an example, well, in the 80s, 90s, and beyond, more academic literature came out that addressed specifically the experiences of women and ways that women and girls were particularly vulnerable during the Holocaust and also were exploited and targeted. That's another link I can share with you. I've done a program specifically about how pregnancy endangered women and that women who were victims of rape were often more vulnerable to violence or killing. But I think that it is a form of intimate violence that we see now taking on that kind of anti-Semitic undertone that Jews, you have been victims enough. So Jewish women, the world doesn't want to hear what happened to you on October 7th, like enough already. And people who are particularly buying into very simplified, oversimplified narratives of Israelis as all-powerful aggressors and Hamas as consistently only victims in any way, freedom fighters. That doesn't sit well in that framework for them because it's not freedom fighting to go and violate a woman. That's just a venal act of power and aggression in that moment. It's not about sex, it's about power and violence and hatred. And so it doesn't fit with that, it doesn't comport with that narrative. And so I really, really respect Sheryl Sandberg and others who have tried to document that testimony, give it a platform, show it more, because in some ways, I think what happened to those women and some men on October 7th and subsequently provides, with their bravery to discuss what happened to them and their very intimate violations, it provides a complicating narrative that might cause someone to think maybe it's not so black and white. Maybe I need to look at this in a more nuanced way. That may be wishful thinking on my part, but that's an analogy that I see.
Yeah, I definitely hear that, and I appreciate your answer. And um, looking at the other questions, someone asked if parents and educators are aware of the different versions of Anne Frank's diary, um, and if it's something that how I mean, there was this person that wrote, how could they have learned about them, and do you believe they know but choose to ignore the fact?
So the different versions. So I'm just going to play armchair psychologist for a moment, and you might call me Dr. Friedberg, but I'm not a psychologist, okay? I have no medical training, but just after more than a quarter century working in this field and having met a lot of parents and teachers, my theory for why so many people get really upset, for example, with the restored sexual or puberty related content in Anne Frank is that it shatters this kind of simpler, innocent, sweet girl image that they had of her. So it could be a generational divide that if someone grew up on a sanitized version, let's say, of the Anne Frank play on Broadway or later movie versions or the revival with Natalie Portman or an early version of the diary, it may be really kind of shocking and jarring and cause cognitive dissonance to hear her talking about menstruation or sexual urges towards a female friend. It's not the Anne they knew and loved. And I don't know if that's a conscious thing. Again, this is just my theory, but I think that if you have an idea, let me give a better analogy. I think many of us have had the experience of reading a book we love, and then seeing it translated into movie form, and it just looks all wrong to us. You know, we're like, that's not what her voice should have been like, or I didn't picture it that way. I think a little of that is happening generationally with Anne Frank, where a book that was seen as kind of safe and innocent and hopeful, and for some people, a kind of almost Christianized ideal of turning the other cheek and of martyrdom, is now again complicated and humanized in a way that is shocking. So that's one of my theories about it.
Thank you. We're at about 9 o'clock, and there's a couple of questions that I'd like to ask if you have time, and everyone, and those of
Yeah.
you that were on, we're happy for you to stay on. But one question here is, with many on the Zoom from the DC area, I am curious if the high school in DC did end up returning to the original curriculum. What was the outcome of the situation?
So that's a long story, and one in which I became overly involved because when you're a Holocaust historian and there is an issue with Holocaust curriculum at the school, other parents are like, hello, will you do something? To the school's credit, they did end up putting the books back in several months later, and we were able to work together to arrange a field trip to the Holocaust Museum where the museum supplied buses and every 10th grader came. But the problems are much, much deeper at that school, and I'm not going to whitewash it. I was being a little polite earlier when I said my son was a student there for 2 years. I actually withdrew him because of anti-Semitic material that was being taught in the classroom. So it was coming from teachers, not from other students. And the school not only did not respond, but actively discouraged me from talking about it, and I filed a Title VI complaint. Now I don't know what will happen because we don't have a really functioning Department of Education, but anyway, it's there. If anyone wants to see the brief, I'm happy to share it. So speaking more as a parent than as a historian, the problems are pretty deep in DC public schools with regard to that, and I'm still thinking it's extremely troubling that they would say, as a result of a terror attack on the Jewish state, we can't teach about the Holocaust. Like, where is the logic in that? If anything, you should be teaching about it more at that moment. You need it more. Teachers might need more support to know how to do it, but it shouldn't be avoided.
Definitely. And I think that leads into really the last question here is someone asked, can you suggest what we as parents can do to battle the censorship trend?
So there are really great groups, considering that I talked about The statistic, I think it was 72% of these kinds of complaints and banning and cutting are now coming from organized groups. Affiliate yourself with groups who are doing the opposite. Look at the American Library Association. I consider them a nonpartisan, great supporter of free access to information, literally free. No constraints on it, but also doesn't cost anything for anyone, and they track this very, very well. And so I would look at them. They need your help. They need your support. People have mixed feelings about PEN America because at times I think they have boycotted some Israeli authors. So I'm not going to tell you to get involved. You can make your own decisions about it, but they are a very good source of information where you can search. They have extremely detailed databases that will show you on a school district by school district basis where there are complaints, what the outcome of it is. You can also search by title, by author. You can look longevity wise to see where the trends are happening. And what you can do also is to lend your support to people who are feeling beleaguered, either as educators or librarians. When that mouse banning happened, it got a lot of press because it was very specific. And it was actually really great. The comic book shop that said it wanted to give away free copies was flooded with donations of people giving them books. And often it is just one lone teacher or one lone librarian who is trying to fight the local fight. Even sending, a letter of moral support to that person. You can usually find their email address on a school website. There are librarians who are getting death threats for keeping books. I mean, it's crazy, the lack of civility. And so I think even just that human touch. And then finally, at your own kid's school, ask to see curricula. First of all, like don't assume that the curriculum is good, that your kid is getting, and ask to see over time if it's changed, if a book has been taken on or off, if they are now just reading a lot of places because there's so much emphasis on STEM and standardized testing. Some school districts are moving away from teaching books in their entirety. They're only teaching excerpts because they think students don't have the attention span. So look at that too and see what are they selectively choosing. Basically, be an activist pain in the ass at your kid's school, if I can be a little rude. Your kid may not like it. I can promise you my kid did not. But it is for the greater good and for making sure that we don't have generations of young people coming out with really distorted ideas because it's not giving them enough credit to think that they can't handle difficult material. They want to. I'll give you one last example that there was a school district in Corpus Christi, Texas, where Diary of Anne Frank, this is about 20 years ago, was had been suspended. The teaching of it had been suspended because of parental complaints. And students, the ones who would have been reading it, took up a letter writing campaign to ask for it to be brought back. And the review board brought it back because the students pushed. So also encourage students to be advocates and to be given the respect to make their own evaluations of hard material, not to be sheltered and infantilized.
Thank you. Yeah, I really appreciate all of your responses. And just also a note, somebody has said that there's a documentary on PBS next Monday called The Librarians about book banning. So some of you might be interested in watching that and how it relates to this talk tonight. And
That's
so,
great. Didn't know.
yeah.
So thank you. And thank you for all of those varied and interesting questions.
Yeah, and thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us and addressing all these questions. It's really been wonderful, and a number of comments have come in saying how much people have learned from you this evening. So it's really wonderful. They much appreciated.
Well, I appreciated being invited by the Haberman Institute. I would love to come back another time, maybe talk about something less depressing. So
Yeah, yeah.
it was really fascinating preparing for tonight, and I thank everyone for attending.